Okay, so last night in the bar, I thought I was just going for a quiet drink, and Dave and Tim came and said, would you be able to do a little session on integration? So I said, yeah, okay, I thought they were joking. Then I woke up this morning, and they came over and said to me again, would you do a session on integration? I said, okay, I'll try, but I haven't got any slides, so I just wrote this while I've been sat down over there. If you remember from the introductions this morning, I'm Gordon Harrison from Gordon Associates, and we've got Parnassus, and we've done a few projects where we've integrated Parnassus to Surpass. And just to help me, I was going to ask how many people have worked on integration projects? Show of hands. Most people. Oh, well, about half, I suppose. So all I've got is some very general sort of practical approaches to the things that basically people have, or I've come up with while we've been doing integration projects at Gordon Associates. The projects that we've done, we linked Parnassus to R11 at Skills First. That was a long time ago, and then we've actually done a recent upgrade on Parnassus and refreshed the link to R11, which was interesting, because our integration, our middleware is quite old, and so is the R11 as well, so we had a few issues with that. And also we did an integration to version 1 of R12 with Cache, which is now part of NCFE. The basic sort of point of the integration is to send eligible learners from Parnassus across to Surpass so that the learners are able to sit the exams. And then once the exams have been sat, the results get returned back to Parnassus. And I won't go into the technology side of things, partly because I've been sort of project managing stuff rather than actually being close to it. But I know there's a difference between, was R11 SOAP-based and R12 REST? Something like that, yeah? Okay, so then that's quite different from a techie thing. The way the integrations work was quite different. We had to write different APIs in Parnassus for that. So for me, the main point when you're doing an integration project is be clear what you're integrating, which may sound really simple, but it's surprising as you work through the project how often that isn't the case. And in my experience, an integration project is 80 to 90% talking and 10 to 20% actually doing code, because there'll be APIs in place already, and it's actually understanding what it is that you're trying to do. So to enable that to happen, you need to be clear in terms of resources, who's meant to be doing what. So you'll typically have a project manager, and you need to make sure that they've got a reasonable working knowledge of what the systems do and what they're capable of. And then, in my experience, you want one of your better developers on the action as well, because if you haven't, then basically you're going to struggle. You need someone that can sort of think outside the box a bit and understand things properly. One of the things I always try and do is make sure that you let the developers talk to each other. There's nothing worse than project managers getting in the way on integration projects, and a developer will say such and such isn't working, or an issue gets reported, and the project manager will try and understand what's going on when they don't really. And then they'll talk to the other project manager, and they might have a vague understanding, and then it goes back down to the developers, and there's mass confusion. It's much better just to say to your developer, there's the problem, talk to the developer at Surpass, at BTL, and sort it out. So we had that when we were working on the Skills First project. I think it was Scott. I don't know if, I've never met Scott. I've spoken to him on the phone. So Scott, you helped us with one thing at Skills First. I think it was on the gender stuff. Was it gender? I can't remember if it was you or someone else. We had a thing where in the new version of Parnassus, when we did the project, you could have genders that weren't male and female. That was one of the reasons that we did the upgrade. So we put the integration in place and started testing it. And as you would expect, a customer says, wow, there's this new feature, we'll go and we'll use it. So they start putting genders into Parnassus that aren't male and female, and then the eligible learners go across into Surpass. And apparently in R11, the way the gender codes are set up, it was only selecting MF, and I can't remember what the other one was, but that was it. So the integration was breaking and the eligibility wasn't working. So we got the developers just talking to each other, and it got sorted out a lot more quickly than it would have done if the project managers were trying to sort it all out. So the other thing I was just going to do was just run through what I've typically sort of come to understand the life cycle of the project to be when you're doing integration. And again, this is all just normal project management stuff, so there's no rocket science in here at all. The first thing would be to try and get a handle on the requirements in terms of what it is that you're actually doing. And by that, I would say understand the processes and understand the data. So you've got to do a data mapping to know what data is going from one system to the other and what's coming back. And in our case, the example of that would be the centres and sites. I presume, I'm not sure what they would be referred to in Surpass. Are they like where the exams sat? How would you? Just centre. So you've got the centre site mapping. Then you've got the qualifications in the units, and you've got to understand how those map into the exams in Surpass. And for us, units map to exams. So you're saying we've got a learner sitting an exam or a unit at a centre or a site. And then the learner needs to be registered on that unit at the centre or site to enable them to be eligible to sit the test. The other thing which is key, like all good comedy, is timing. You need to understand what the processes are in terms of when the information has to move between the systems. So basically, once you've got the data mapping and a good idea of the process about what goes from A to B and then from B back to A and when, then you begin to get a basic understanding of what the integration is and how it needs to work. In the day and age of agile development, there's often a tendency not to write very much down, which is fine, but I think I'd strongly recommend, or what we found is you have to write enough down to know what you're doing, and also have a reference point that you can go back and test against, because the customer, in amongst all this, needs to know what they're buying. So you need a spec that's written down with some clear deliverables on it so that the customer can test against it, and the good old developers have got something to work to, because if they don't know what they've got to deliver, then it's all going to go horribly wrong. So once you've got the requirements, then you move into a development phase. Even though most of the time the APIs are fairly well developed now, there may be a need to actually enhance the APIs in some areas or write some middleware. We've got middleware that sits in between Parnassus and Surpass to handle things. The middleware might need modifying to take account of things. We had to do that a couple of times in the recent project that we did at Skills First. Then once you've done your development, invariably you should do some form of testing, unit testing as I'd call it. Once everyone knows that their component parts are working, then you would install to a test system and do some form of UAT, which would typically involve the customer at that point. So you'll then have three parties involved. You'll have actively involved. You'll have the both integration partners and the customer starts testing. And invariably, well, nothing's ever worked straight away on any of my projects. I don't know if it's like that for anyone else. I would think it is. So you need a way of tracking issues clearly. If you don't have that, then it's a real struggle to understand what's going on the actual project. And to have some form of regular progress. And I've found in my experience, you've basically got to have at least weekly progress meetings once you're going on some kind of UAT phase, just to really see what's going on. And by this time, the customer will be saying, when's this going to go live? They might have said that earlier on in the project, but in my experience, they start saying, we need to let our customers know when the system's going to change. So having some form of regular progress meeting typically it's a conference call on a Friday or something at the end of the week, where the customer shines a bright light in your eyes and says, how's it going? Why aren't all these issues fixed yet? We're meant to be going live in 3 weeks. That's a good way of focusing things and keeping things on track. And when I do those kind of progress calls, I'll have myself and the lead developer on. And I know when we did, is Jen here, who worked on the Skills First thing? I've never met Jen, but Jen was the project manager when we did the Skills First project. That have been Jen and myself and Cheryl from Skills First and the developers on the call. So we'd have gone through and made things were being progressed okay. And then as the number of issues reduces and the testing starts to work, then you get towards the end of the UAT phase, everyone cheers, you can have a bit of a look at the go live date and then do the install to live. And the other thing, which is, again, is blatantly obvious really, when you do the install to live, don't just install it to live and say to the customer, there you go, install it to live and check it works. Because sometimes, even with the best will in the world, something isn't quite right. Then once you've tested it, then you can hand it back to the customer, remembering to delete any data that you've added on the live system, so you don't have Mickey Mouse flying around on the system as a user or a learner or something like that. So when I do projects, that's how I try and run them. It's in a simple and pragmatic way. And the one thing that I've always tried and do is have some form of checklists. There was a Horizon program on telly about eight or 9 years ago, and I watched it and I thought, well, that's really good. And the basic point of the program, it was showing how in the medical profession, people were dying in operations because when they arrived, all the notes and various other things hadn't been correctly logged and catalogued. And someone came up with a checklist system where they just had with each patient a checklist of all the things to make sure that everything had been done and all the right things were being done. And it's so simple, but they were saying these checklists were saving people's lives. And you just think, well, when you go to hospital, you just expect all that to happen. So if something like surgery and the medical profession needs something like that, having simple checklists to help you run projects and keep a track of everything is just, it's obvious and it's common sense. But it's surprising how often that doesn't get done. So I actually looked about a month ago, and that program, and it's not on there anymore. You can find it, but it doesn't play. But it's a really interesting program to watch, just where they sort of go through the process of saying all these things were happening and people were dying, and some bright spark came up with the idea of having a checklist, and it's just so obvious, really. I haven't got anything else left to say, Dave. So has anyone got any questions? Okay.
Well, thanks very much.
Okay, okay, no problem. So that's Craig, that's not me. Thank you.
I'm going to start asking you to present more without any notice. Ian?
I couldn't remember who I was. I should have picked them under the table. I should have done.
Thank you very much for filling in as well.
Thank you. Hello everybody. I came here today thinking I was going to have a really easy day, just sit back and watch everyone else struggle and present, and then Tim Burnett came to me this morning with a panicked look in his eye, and I knew something was wrong, and mentioned that Craig can't be here. I feel like he's watching me and judging me from... So I was asked if I could do something, so apologies in advance. I've done even less than Gordon prepared there. I literally wrote mine as Gordon was talking. So I work for a company called Peltech. We're a small software company. We've written an endpoint assessment solution which deals specifically for standards-based apprenticeships. And our original customer was Innovate Awarding. They really kind of were right out at the front and made the decision about how they thought standards-based apprenticeships should work, because not many people seemed to have a great idea about it 2 years ago. And really we've developed that system in conjunction with them, and we've now rolled it out to several other customers. I don't know, have we got SQA in the room? Have they managed to hide? So SQA, one of our more recent customers. And we're growing that product. It's coming along very nicely. One of the things that happened during our development process is that Innovate said that they're working with BTL and they wanted to integrate the online testing platform with our platform. So that was great. We just used the RESTful API, so we don't have any of the problems that Gordon experienced. It was actually relatively painless. And I was actually trying to think about my experience of that project, and I've got to be honest, my experience of that project was a phone call with Craig Stranwick, who said, it's really straightforward, it's all documented, BTL will talk you through it. I gave it to one of my lead developers. He had a phone call with Craig. And then the next thing I knew, we were kind of sharing data between the two systems, and shortly after that, it went live. So it was really quite straightforward. There were some problems, of course there were some problems, but it was relatively straightforward. Our integration is quite simple, and actually listening to some of the things that were going on this morning, I was thinking, without wishing to make Innovate feel less proud of what they've achieved, it seems really, really straightforward what we do. So in our platform, in the background, you will build an assessment plan. That assessment plan will have a set number of components to it, and one of those components may be the online testing component. And then what happens then is actually as an endpoint assessor goes through and carries out the endpoint assessment, they come to that particular component and schedule it. Then it talks to the Surpass API, creates the test in Surpass, gets the code back ready for the test to be delivered. On the day of the test, the code is then given to the apprentice. We did email it out at first, and I think now you've got the endpoint assessors giving it out instead. Is that right? Candidate goes on, takes the test, and then we get all the results back into our application. And in terms of what Innovate will see, they can go in, they can look at the overall result, and then they can expand that out, and they can actually see all of the data that sits behind it. They can look at actually the feedback from every single question if they want to. So there's quite a rich amount of data that we pull back from the system. And that's kind of it. I think recently we added in a couple of other nice features so that if a candidate requires a paper version of the test rather than just a straight screen test, we've built an option in so that, again, as you're scheduling it, you can pick that option for the candidate. So if they've got any special requirements, we can cope with that. And really, all I would say to you after this is just some things that followed on from Gordon, really. In my experience, it always is the case to get the right people talking together. I knew immediately from the phone call with Craig Stranwick that I was going to be no use in that project, and so put a developer to talk. My golden rule with anything that involves third parties, especially another software company, is that you can double or treble your estimates on how long this is going to take. And usually that comes down to what Gordon was saying, and that is you just don't let the right people talk to one another. So it is really key. Let the techies get their geek on. Let them go and talk to one another. And you get on with the other important stuff. Tell the customers. The other thing I would say as well is when you talk to your customers and when you're actually looking at what you want to do with an integration, keep asking yourself why you want to do the integration and what it is you really want to get out of the end of it and what the end goal is and what's really important to you. I think a lot of people get very excited when they start software projects and they think, we can have this and we'll add that and we'll do this and this will be really cool and we'll automate everything. One of the things I always do is try and talk people down to start off with and say, what else could we get rid of? What could we not have? What could you do without? Could we keep that manual for now? So that you start off with a very, very simple product or project and then start adding the complexity back in. Because 9 times out of 10, what you know you definitely, absolutely need at the start of a project, you don't. You need something that was a little bit like it, but maybe completely different in the end. So, yeah, I would say let people talk to one another. Keep your ideas simple to start off with. Don't try and, Don't try and swallow the whole thing at once. I can't remember what the phrase is, but you know where I'm driving at there. In terms of BTL and Surpass, we found them excellent to work with, no issues. We've had glitches up and down, but I think we've managed to work through everything so far. I'm seeing a nod from Innovate at the back, that's good. SQA, I know are not going to go with the integration straight away because you're upgrading to the later version, but we're all ready to go when that happens. So that's it. So again, if anybody's got any questions, I'll try and answer them. I'm guessing not. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for that really insightful kind of feedback. Yeah, and thanks for filling in at such short notice. So, although Craig isn't here, he did send me through some of the things he's going to talk about. So, it's probably worth spending 1 minute because he has put some useful stuff in here around kind of his kind of positives and negatives as well about the API. So, I'll literally just read this out. So, he says the API is a standards-based integration, so a range of third-party tools can be used to build and test. So comprehensive web services in Surpass, so all areas can be automated, including adding system users, booking exams, resits, fetching results and analysis. Well-documented and built-in test harness, something that Scott almost showed you earlier but didn't quite manage. Highly reliable, generally issue-free integration, works as expected, and scalable. Large data sets are returned in pages rather than as large data sets. So this is something we've kind of worked really hard to get to this point. And then he was kind enough to send through some cons that I renamed suggestions for improvement. So he said that the API doesn't have the ability to create tests dynamically. So this is kind of a gap that we're aware of. So you can create items and tests via the API, but what you can't do is assign items to a test and create your tests like you can in the test creation UI. That's quite a complicated thing to achieve in the UI, and the kind of the interface for the API, we expect that's quite complex. So that is currently a gap in the API. And he also made the point that services are quite data orientated and rather than business orientated. So when you're trying to do certain business tasks with the API, it can involve making a lot of single calls to get to a single record. So this is kind of feedback that we've acknowledged. So although one thing that Craig probably isn't aware of is the work we've done with the OAPI. And I think that was kind of a bit more pragmatic approach. So rather than, I won't get my geek on too much as Ian said, but rather than kind of a pure RESTful approach that we've looked at with the version 2 of the API, we were a bit more pragmatic and kind of looked at actually where is the load being, what information is trying to be transferred, and we kind of targeted the API at that to essentially improve performance and get it as efficient as possible. And then he quite cryptically talked about 3 small projects that took him 2 to 3 days each, but that's all the information I have on those. But I'll let your imagination run away with you what those were. Okay, so I don't think there are any questions. So now we're going to talk about a few of the integration projects that BTL have worked on. So the first one was something we did for the Institute of Masters of Wine. So Jen Warhurst, the account manager for IMW, is going to come and talk to us about kind of what that integration entailed and tell you a bit more about the Masters of Wine. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an integration, a simple integration we've done with Turnitin, so the plagiarism detection platform. And also, as Andy mentioned earlier, I'll give you a bit more of an overview of what we did internally, because we introduced internally at BTL like a certified Surpass expert accreditation, and we kind of put together kind of an automated process from signing up to that, taking the exam and culminating getting a digital badge if you pass that qualification. So I'll talk about how the integration worked in that internal project. But for now, Jen, if you'd like to, yeah, can you unlock that? Do you want this one? Yeah. You want this one?
Oh yeah, I do, actually. Dressed with pockets, it's the future. Hello everyone, good afternoon. So I am, let's get rid of this, going to be talking about a piece of integration that we did for a customer of mine, the Institute of Masters of Wine. They are a new customer of ours, so I will talk a little bit about the organisation and the structure of their qualification and what we did to bring Surpass into their operational ecosystem. So the Institute of Masters of Wine are the examining body that administers the Masters of Wine exam. It's the highest recognised academic award in wine, and the Institute are the sole awarding body in the world. Around 8 people qualify every year, giving it an average pass rate of 10%, so it is a particularly difficult qualification to achieve. The rigorous and demanding course starts with an admissions exam, which is sat at home. So it's delivered on Surpass, and candidates are given a list of wines that they have to go out and purchase, and then they'll sit at their desk at home and they have to swill a few glasses of wine and then answer questions on it. So following that, the candidates undertake 2 years of coursework, which is primarily independent learning. There are then 3 high-stakes exams that the candidates need to pass, which are a mixture of theory and practical exams. And then the final hurdle of writing a research paper. So, as with all of our customers, the Institute of Masters of Wines have their own unique challenges in their exams. The practical exams that they undertake means that the candidates need a pretty large desk space so that they have room for the 12 different glasses of wines that they'll be tasting. Personally, I think that there are bigger problems to have, but there you go. This requirement does mean that it's quite difficult for them to find suitable test centres, and it also means that the desk real estate is pretty valuable, which is one of the reasons that IMW operate a BYOD model, because a laptop or tablet obviously takes up significantly less space than a keyboard and mouse. Moving back to the world of integration, which is why we're all here, what we've worked with them most closely to overcome is what we do for them after the exam's finished. So the problem with this that they have is that anyone that's qualified to mark the essay responses are people that are already qualified Masters of Wine. So it gives them quite a niche marking subset to go to. And anyone with a Masters in Wine lives rather a glamorous jet-set lifestyle, travelling all over the world, going between vineyards, doing presentations and talks, and advising wine buyers. It's surprisingly similar to being a account manager at BTL. Because of this, it's less than ideal for the Masters of Wine to be reliant on internet connection to get access to those completed scripts. So they prefer to do their marking on paper. So because Surpass is primarily designed as an on-screen application, this isn't a scenario that a customer has ever asked us for before. Because of this, it then meant that we could get a little bit more creative with the options that we came up with. So the first option was that we go with the traditional route, which would take us to do some development within Surpass to build this functionality. So it would be the usual process of planning and development and then go through the normal release cycle. The option 2 was then to go for a lightweight Azure Logic app, which would then integrate with and sit outside of Surpass. So the benefits to option 2 were quite clear to us. It wouldn't be dependent on a release, meaning that we could get it set up a bit faster and in use by the customer sooner. It would integrate with Dropbox, which meant that would give pretty minimal disruption to the customer's operational process. Shorter development time, and it was also able to more easily meet the customer's detailed requirements on how they want the scripts to be exported for the different exams that they sit. So we decided to go for option 2. As the exams will have already been flagged as mark test externally, the exam would straight away hit the audit screen once it had been completed by the candidate. Once it arrives here, it then moves on to the Logic app, which will then magically convert the ones and zeros that come out of Surpass into something that looks more like a completed exam script. So that then gets turned into a PDF by the Logic app, and it then gets saved in a pre-agreed folder structure in the Institute's Dropbox account. From there, they can then allocate the completed scripts to markers as per their usual process. So the theory exams that they have are allocated to markers by item. So for these exams, the app knows to split the script into items, and then they have one folder for question 1, one folder for question 2 that all of the exams that then get split up into. And then for their practical exams, the entire script just gets extracted as a whole PDF document, and that is sent and sat in one practical exam folder. So the markers then get access to their allocated scripts that they can download or print and take off with them to whichever exotic destination they're going to next. The app proved to work really well in their first exam series earlier this year. It fulfills a really simple function to the customer's exact brief. Since then, we've discussed some other scenarios with the Institute of Masters of Wine for integration that we could do. The nature of the Azure app means that this has been quite an easy change for us, because we've then been able to take the feedback from them, and we haven't needed to align a whole Scrum team of developers. It's just the one developer that we had working on this, and we're now able to add some more functionality to allow this to be used for formative assessments. So the formative assessments that they have are seminar and course days. So they take these exams throughout the year, where the structure of the day are, in the morning the candidates will sit a mock exam, and then in the afternoon a Master of Wine will come and talk them through how they should have answered it. So what we do is, the second that they've then completed their exams, it goes through the usual process again of going to the Logic app, and then ends up in their Dropbox account. They can go and find their completed script, take that out of there, and we actually did some work with the formative assessments so that they are extracted as Word documents rather than PDFs, because it meant that the candidates could kind of annotate those on their laptops themselves in Word, or if they wanted to print them off, and it was just a little bit easier for that particular user case. So with any integration, the aim is obviously to make a business process flow smoothly from one particular place to another without any manual intervention. And this particular development is a great example of that. And in using a different approach to our usual features in Surpass, we were then able to go one better than the original brief and deliver a more useful feature to the customer.